The laughter started before she even touched the rifle. Sergeant Major Dwyer stood at the end of the line with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was worse than laughing. The others, Kellish, Brandt, Orvek, the three who had been running the 3rd Battalion's long-range marksmanship program for a combined total of 31 years. They laughed openly. The kind of laugh that doesn't bother to hide itself because it doesn't have to. The new specialist had arrived at CFB Wainwright on a Tuesday in March, when the Alberta prairie was still frozen and the wind came flat across the plains with nothing to stop it. Her name was Navarre. Corporal Zoe Navarre, transferred from 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group in Petawawa. No prior sniper training on record, no special qualifications listed, nothing that explained why she had been assigned to the battalion's most demanding program. The paperwork that accompanied her said only that she had been recommended by someone above Dwyer's pay grade. He had read it twice and still didn't understand it. Kellish said what everyone was thinking. They sent us a mechanic. He wasn't entirely wrong. Navarre's file showed 2 years as a vehicle technician before a lateral transfer to infantry. She was 28 years old. She had the compact build of someone who worked with her hands and the quiet that sometimes comes from spending long hours alone with machinery. She did not introduce herself to the group. She did not try to explain her presence. She put her kit down in the corner of the equipment room and waited to be told what to do next. This was the first thing Dwyer noticed about her. Not the lack of qualifications, not the improbable transfer. The waiting. She was very good at waiting. What Dwyer didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Navarre had been waiting for this specific moment for 3 years. She had not asked to be here. She had not lobbied for the assignment, or pulled strings, or called in favors. But when the call came, she had packed her kit in 40 minutes and driven herself to the airport without telling anyone where she was going. The program at Wainwright was 9 weeks. The Advanced Sniper Qualification Course, known unofficially as the Quiet Mile, was the Canadian Armed Forces' most selective marksmanship stream. Candidates needed a minimum score of 88% on the preliminary range assessment just to be considered. The average attrition rate was 60%. Of the 14 men and women who had passed through in the last 2 years, none had been a former vehicle technician from Petawawa. Dwyer ran the assessment on the first afternoon. He ran it the same way he always did, because he was the kind of instructor who believed that consistency was the only honest measure. 200 meters, 300, 500, iron sights on the first 2 stages, optics permitted on the third, standard military target, 6-inch center mass, 10 rounds at each distance. You needed 24 out of 30 to pass. 24 was the floor. Anything below that, and you went home before supper. Kellish pulled Navarre aside before the range opened and told her she was welcome to withdraw voluntarily. He said it with a kind of professional courtesy that didn't quite cover the contempt underneath. He told her the program wasn't designed for candidates without a proper marksmanship background, and that there was no shame in recognizing when a placement had been made in error. He used the word placement, the way people use formal language to say something they know is rude. Navarre listened to all of it. She thanked him. She did not withdraw. At 200 meters, she went 10 for 10. At 300, she went 10 for 10. At 500 meters, with a wind reading of 18 kilometers per hour coming in at a 30-degree angle across the range, she went 9 for 10 and then asked for the wind data for the one she missed. Dwyer gave it to her. She looked at the number for a moment, not writing anything down, and then said that she had used the wrong value for the Coriolis correction because she had assumed they were farther north. She wasn't wrong about the physics. She was wrong about the latitude, which in the field would be a preparation error, not a technique error. She understood the difference and said so. Dwyer wrote something in his notebook. He didn't share what it was. Kellish said, "Lucky grouping." He said it quietly to Brandt, but not quietly enough. Navarre heard him. She didn't look up from the equipment table where she was clearing her rifle. She just said, the wind at 500 was 18.3. The scope I was issued drifts 0.2, right per click at this temperature. If you want, I can show you the math. Nobody asked her to show the math. The second week of the program was spotting. Each candidate was paired with an observer and run through a series of stalks, low crawls across open ground, identifying targets at unknown distances, calculating solutions without ranging equipment. The goal was to teach candidates to read terrain the way a person reads a familiar text. Distance, elevation, mirage, wind. Every variable compressed into a firing solution that had to be right the first time, because in the field there was no second time. Navarre was paired with a senior corporal named Orvek, who had been with the program for 4 years and who did not hide his skepticism about the pairing. Orvek was meticulous, experienced, and used to working with candidates who came to him with at least a basic foundation. He ran his first stalk with Navarre in silence, watching her move, watching her calculate, watching her do things he hadn't taught her yet. After the stalk, he asked her where she had learned the Memrad holdover system she was using. It wasn't the one taught in the Canadian program. It was a modified version, hybridized, more precise at extended ranges but more mathematically demanding. Navarre said she had worked it out herself. She said it the way someone says something obvious, without drama or pride, just as a statement of fact. Orvek said, "You worked it out yourself." "I had a lot of time in Petawawa," she said. "There's a 3-kilometer range behind the vehicle bay. I used to go out on maintenance days." Orvek asked what she was shooting on maintenance days. She told him she had built a custom .338 Lapua from surplus parts over 18 months. She had machined some of the components herself. She said the barrel was the hard part. She had gotten it wrong twice before she got it right. Orvek sat with this information for a moment. "You machined the barrel." "The first 2 were off-spec," she said. "I miscalculated the rifling twist rate. The third one grouped sub-MOA at 800. Orvek wrote nothing in his notebook, but after that, he stopped asking her to repeat steps he'd already seen her complete correctly. It was a small thing. It was the first small thing. Dwyer watched all of this from a distance, the way he watched everything, without reacting in ways people could read. He had been running the quiet mile for 7 years. He had seen candidates who were naturally gifted, and candidates who were technically excellent, and candidates who were both, and still couldn't hold it together when conditions degraded. The ones who washed out usually washed out in week 4. Week 4 was when the field exercises started and the controlled environment of the range gave way to wind and cold, and the kind of discomfort that is not dramatic, but simply continuous. The low-grade friction of everything being slightly harder than it needs to be. That was when you found out who people actually were. He was not yet sure what Navarre was. The trouble with Kellish started in week 3. It didn't start as trouble. It started as a series of decisions that each looked reasonable in isolation and were unreasonable in aggregate. Kellish modified Navarre's equipment assignments without documenting the changes. He moved her scheduled range time to conflict with a mandatory briefing, then logged that she had missed the briefing voluntarily. He assigned her the oldest optics in the inventory, equipment that had been flagged for calibration issues and then cleared without being properly serviced. Navarre noticed the optics issue on the first day of use. She said nothing to Dwyer. She recalibrated what she could recalibrate in the field and adjusted her calculations to compensate for the remaining drift. She did her range session. She passed. She said nothing to Dwyer because she had seen this before. Not here, not in this specific form, but the shape of it was familiar. The small obstructions. The administrative friction that looks like paperwork and isn't. She knew that bringing it forward too early would make her look like someone who looked for problems, and looking like that was its own kind of disqualification. She kept records instead. A small notebook, military issue, that she carried in her left breast pocket. Every discrepancy, every modification, every timing change, written down with a date and time and the name of the person who had communicated it to her. She had learned this from her grandmother, who had worked for 30 years in a federal ministry in Ottawa and who had told her once that the most important professional skill was documentation. "They can argue with your memory," her grandmother had said. "They cannot argue with your notebook." Navarre's grandmother had been right about most things. The crisis, when it came in week 4, on a Thursday, in the middle of a crosswind exercise at the 700-meter range. Kellish had been assigned to observe the session. He had the authority to call firing solutions invalid for technical reasons, and he used it. 3 of Navarre's shots were called invalid on grounds that Dwyer, watching from the scoring position, could not immediately verify. By the third call, Navarre had put down her rifle and was looking at Kellish with an expression that Orvek, standing nearby, later described as completely still. She asked Kellish, in a level voice, to state the technical reason for each invalid call. Kellish said the firing position had been compromised. He used the standard language, the language of the evaluation rubric, the language that was technically defensible, and that also happened to be, in this case, incorrect. Navarre said, "My left elbow was within tolerance on all 3 shots. I can show you the footage." Every session on the Wainwright range was recorded. This was standard. Kellish knew it was standard. He said the footage would need to be reviewed before any determination could be made. Navarre said, "I'd like Sergeant Major Dwyer to review it now." This was the moment, not the shooting, not the scores. The moment when she asked for the review and didn't phrase it as a question. Orvek would remember this later, the grammatical precision of it. She hadn't said, "I'd like to request." She hadn't said, "Would it be possible?" She had said what she wanted, clearly and without hedging, in a situation where everyone in the area knew that hedging would be read as weakness. Dwyer reviewed the footage. All 3 shots were within tolerance. The positions were clean. The calls were wrong. He said nothing to Kellish in the moment. He corrected the scoring record, reinstated all 3 shots as valid, and told the range to resume. Kellish stood at the edge of the range with his arms at his sides, and Dwyer noted, without commenting on it, that Kellish's jaw was set in the specific way it's set when he had misjudged something and knew it. That evening, Dwyer pulled Navarre's notebook, not her field notebook. He asked her, at the end of the day, whether she had kept any record of the equipment and scheduling issues she had experienced. He asked it the way someone asks a question they already know the answer to. She gave him the small blue notebook from her breast pocket without hesitation. He read it for 11 minutes. He had a habit, when he was reading something that required his full attention, of going very quiet in a way that was different from his normal quiet. The people who worked with him closely knew the difference. Orvek knew it. After 7 years, Orvek could read Dwyer's silence the way a trained observer reads a range. When Dwyer finished, he had to set the notebook down on the table between them and said, "How long have you been keeping this?" "Since day 2, she said. "Why day 2 and not day 1? "Day 1, I thought it might be adjustment," she said. "Candidates get a rough first day sometimes. By day 2, I knew it wasn't adjustment." Dwyer looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The optics on your rifle on day 9, you recalibrated them yourself as much as I could," she said. "The internal 0 had drifted. I couldn't fully correct it in the field, so I adjusted my solutions. You compensated mathematically for faulty equipment rather than reporting the fault." "Yes. Why?" She considered this. She didn't answer immediately, which Dwyer had come to understand was how she handled questions she wanted to answer accurately rather than quickly. "Because I knew if I reported it, the day would become about the equipment and not about my shooting," she said. "I needed the day to be about my shooting." Dwyer picked up her notebook and put it in his own breast pocket. He told her he would return it. He told her the matter would be handled at his level. He told her to continue with the program. She said, "I'm not worried about the program." He looked at her. "I'm worried about it," she said, "in the normal sense, but not about whether I'll finish it." This was not arrogance. Dwyer had spent enough time around arrogance to know its shape. This was something quieter, more structural. It was the statement of someone who had done the calculation a long time ago and was now simply running the arithmetic in real time. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he believed her. What followed was less dramatic than a confrontation and more consequential than a report. Dwyer met with the program oversight board on a Friday afternoon, presented the notebook, presented the range footage, and presented his own observations in the flat, chronological, evidence-first manner that had made him effective in these situations over a long career. He was not emotional about it. He did not need to be. The documentation was thorough because Navarre had been thorough, and thoroughness, in a boardroom as on a range, does most of the necessary work. Kellish was removed from the evaluation team for the remainder of the course. He was not discharged. He was not formally disciplined in the ways that would follow him on paper. because the board was cautious in the way institutional bodies are cautious, weighing the evidence against the disruption of action. But he was removed, and the removing was itself a statement. In units like this one, people understood the language of what was left unsaid. Brandt, who had said nothing and done nothing and watched, and whose silence had been its own form of endorsement, was reassigned to administrative duties for the final weeks. Dwyer had recommended this not as punishment, but as a structural correction. He did not explain this distinction to Brandt, because he felt Brandt was old enough to understand it on his own. The remaining 5 weeks of the program were different, not easier. The program was not designed to be easy, and Dwyer had no interest in making it easier, but the friction that had been manufactured was gone, and without it, Navarre's performance had room to be what it actually was. At 900 meters, she hit a 10-centimeter target with a first-round hit in a 20-kilometer crosswind. The target was a standard steel plate at unknown range. She had to estimate the distance herself without instrumentation, using terrain features and the angular size of the target against her reticle. Her range estimate was 4 meters off. Her windage correction was exact. Orvek, who was spotting, called the hit and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "How did you get the wind that precise?" She said, "I watched the mirage on the ground between 200 and 400 meters. The shear layer was giving me the surface gradient. The rest was interpolation." Orvek had been doing this for a long time. He had seen candidates hit targets at 900 meters. He had not seen many candidates explain exactly why they had hit a target at 900 meters in terms that he couldn't immediately find fault with. He wrote it in his notes. Later, he would tell Dwyer that watching Navarre shoot was like watching someone do arithmetic. Not in the mechanical sense, but in the sense of watching a person think. Every shot was the conclusion of a visible process. She wasn't guessing and getting lucky. She was calculating and being right, and the difference between those two things was everything. The final exercise was run on a morning in mid-May, when the Alberta cold had finally begun to give way to something that was almost spring. Candidates were individually staged and given a scenario, a simulated field position, a set of conditions that changed every 40 minutes, and a sequence of targets that escalated in difficulty. The scoring was cumulative. Each candidate's total determined their final program grade. The high score in the program's history was held by a master corporal who had gone on to serve as a sniper instructor at CFB Gagetown. The score was 89.4 out of 100. Navarre scored 91.2. Dwyer looked at the number for a long time after the scoring was closed. He had a procedure for this, for high scores, which involved rechecking the data and then rechecking the recheck, because in his experience numbers, that surprised you were numbers worth verifying twice. He verified it. The number did not change. He found her afterwards at the equipment return station where she was breaking down her rifle with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. He stood beside her for a moment, watching. She did not look up immediately. When she did, she looked at him the way she always did, direct, uncomplicated, waiting. He said, "You knew you were going to pass before you got here." She said, "I knew I was capable of passing. That's not the same as knowing I would." He thought about this. "What's the difference?" "The difference is equipment calibration and wind," she said, "and whether the people around you are doing their jobs honestly." Dwyer didn't say anything for a moment. "You weren't certain," he said. "I was prepared," she said. "I try not to confuse those two things." He held out her small blue notebook, the one he had carried in his breast pocket for 5 weeks. She took it. She didn't look at it. She put it back in her left breast pocket and continued breaking down the rifle. Dwyer walked back across the range to the administration building, past the fence line where, on the first afternoon, the laughter had started. The range was empty now. The targets had been struck and stored. The wind moved across the open ground the way it always did in Alberta. Continuous, indifferent, carrying nothing with it but itself. He thought about what Navarre had said. Prepared, not certain. He had been teaching people to shoot for a long time, and that was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him about the discipline. Not confidence, not certainty. Preparation, which was the only honest thing you could bring to a variable you couldn't fully control. He had spent the last 9 weeks watching someone do the math correctly, under conditions designed to make the math harder. What she had done wasn't surprising. Not really, not if you had watched it accumulate the way he had. But it was worth something. It was worth more than the score, which was already worth more than anything he'd recorded in 7 years. He wrote the grade in the program log and closed the book and did not write anything else, because the grade said what needed to be said, and adding anything to it would only diminish it. The following Monday, Corporal Zoe Navarre was formally assessed as qualified under the Advanced Sniper Qualification Course standards. Her file was updated. The recommendation that accompanied it, written by Dwyer in the flat, precise language he used for all official documents, contained one sentence that was not strictly required by the assessment rubric. It said, "Candidate demonstrated exceptional capacity to perform under conditions of institutional friction and equipment degradation without loss of accuracy or professional composure." Nobody who read the report needed it explained. The score spoke. The notebook, which no one outside the oversight board ever saw, had spoken first, and the rifle, which had been asked to do its job honestly and had done it, had spoken from the beginning in the only language that couldn't be argued with. The small, definitive sound of a hit carried back across 900 meters of Alberta wind.